I suppose the best place to start when you talk about trade unionism and how trade unions started in this country is probably around about the tail end of the 18th century when the Industrial Revolution took place. So the Industrial Revolution brought with it huge leaps in technology, in the production of things like iron and steel and textiles, petroleum, coal, farm goods and so on. And the whole economy was transformed by these innovations. And one of the things it brought about was what's called proletarianisation, which is basically the creation of the working class and bringing working people together in social production. So it brought them to places of work, so things like factories and mills, mines and so on. So the socialism of labour, communal areas of work, worked in the ruling class's benefit in that it was much easier for them to manage and collectivise work, but it also gave them a problem, which was whenever you pushed against the working class were all in the same building at the same time, talking to each other, agreeing what they had in common and organising. So while we're before the age of what we would call modern trade unions, what I'm going to look at is a couple of examples of how working class people collectivised and pushed back against the ruling class, not necessarily in victory, but pushed back against the ruling class for things that they were aggrieved about. Okay, so the Industrial Revolution, workers suffered terribly. Mass exploitation of men, women and children. No one was safe. Everyone was exploited by the ruling class during that particular period. And working class families lived in appalling conditions. So things like lack of running water and sanitation, disease, overcrowding and starvation being part of daily life. And part of that was because the housing hadn't progressed as quickly as the industrial side of things had progressed. So while factory owners built these enormous factories with machines and God knows what else they needed to do the work, housing didn't progress. So they were slums basically, and they were almost always overcrowded with all the problems that I just described. So that's the backdrop to what I was going to talk about today. So there were two, I'm going to stress these aren't exhaustive. So I'm going to pick two examples of where working class people organised and pushed back. And one of the most famous ones is the Merthyr Rising. So the Merthyr Rising started in Wales in 1831 in Merthyr Tydfil in South Wales at the Dowlais Ironworks, which is one of many ironworks to establish themselves in Merthyr in the late 18th century. So again, like I just said, as industry exploded, so the population exploded with it. And the population of the town exploded. Workers lived in cramped and very unsanitary conditions. But to further the suffering of the workers, the ironworks introduced something called the truck system. And the truck system was a method by which the owner of the ironworks didn't pay you in cash. They paid you in tokens. And those tokens were only exchangeable in a shop that the ironworks owner owned. So not only could the ironworker owner control how much they paid you, they could control how much you spent, because they had control of what you spent your earnings on. Just move on. So the radicals of Merthyr organised into a political union in 1830 calling for demonstrations against the truck system and something called the Corn Laws. Now the Corn Laws were laws that prevented the importation of cheap corn. Now corn's a collective term, but it includes grain, barley and wheat. And it was designed to stop cheap imports, keeping the price high, keeping profits for the landowners that created wheat and barley and grain high. But of course the knock-on effect of that, it made things like bread and beer and other things very expensive. So they were pushing back against that, and by the end of 1831 the scope of the union expanded to campaign for full political reforms. They'd gone beyond things like the truck system and were moving on to the right for working class men to vote. And some reforms have been included in a bill to Parliament around about that time, but the reforms didn't include extending the vote to the working class man, and it was defeated in any case. So there was a conflagration of factors that created the Merthyr Rising. So the two were the truck system and the Corn Laws, but then there was things like poor living conditions, unemployment, poverty, no vote, and then something else called the Court of Requests. And the Court of Requests was it was established to settle debts. So if someone had a debt the Court of Request would allow the creditor to seize goods from the debtor as payment for that debt. And it meant that obviously already impoverished working class people also had their possessions taken from them as well when they couldn't pay their bills. So let's find a place. So the workers were driven to a mass meeting of 2,000 workers, and the 2,000 workers discussed the issues and decided that they would try to basically petition the king directly to call for the abolition of the Court of Requests and to bring to the attention the appalling wages in the iron industry. This was after a series of job losses that were happening in the industry at the same time. So workers became further agitated after a chap called Lewis Lewis. Lewis Lewis had his possessions seized by the Court of Requests. He owed a debt to a shopkeeper. So the Merthyr Rising, the most active people within the Rising, faced down the bailiffs from the Court of Requests and said, you're not going to take this guy's stuff. So the Court of Requests did a bit of negotiating. They said, well, look, I'll tell you what, we'll take one trunk. We'll take one trunk, that will settle our debt, and we'll call it a day. So the protesters said, OK, that's fair enough. So they let them take the trunk, and then they went round to the shopkeeper's house and nicked the trunk back and gave it back to Lewis Lewis. So over the next day or two, they went from house to house to take items from creditors that were awarded to them by the Court of Request and return them to their rightful owners. And the movement had developed into a full-scale uprising. And this is, as legend would have it, where the first red flag was raised. So the story goes they had a white flag. It was dipped in calf's blood, I believe, to make it red, and then it was stuck on a pole and held aloft, and it's been the sign of worker revolution ever since. And from the following week, confrontations then continued to take place. So there was confrontations taking place between workers and soldiers from multiple regiments. They brought in the cavalry from all directions to try and put down these protests, because that's essentially what happens. You know, you go from the Merthyr Rising to the miners' strike. It's the same response from the ruling class. They'll hit you with the fullest force. And then soldiers fired muskets into a crowd around the Castle Hotel in Merthyr, and 16 unarmed working protesters were killed. So the authorities continued to take swift and direct action, arresting and trying the ringleaders of the rising, and indeed trying and executing a chap called Dick Penderyn. Now, Dick Penderyn was just there on a protest. He wasn't a leader, he wasn't an agitator, he was just someone who was there along with everyone else. He was accused and found guilty of stabbing and wounding a soldier and was hung for it. Even though there was an 11,000 signature petition calling for his death sentence to be commuted, he hung for it anyway. So leaders of the rising were then sentenced to things like death, imprisonment, transportation to Australia. And Dick Penderyn was believed, and had always been believed, to be innocent. He proclaimed his innocence all the way through. And then eventually a man called Ianto Parker, who was living in the USA at the time, confessed on his deathbed to stabbing and wounding the soldier for which Penderyn hung. And just as at Peterloo, we'll all know about the Peterloo massacre. It's at Petersfield in Manchester, when 15 protesters were killed by cavalry. And it was a similar sort of thing that the Merthyr campaigners were fighting for. They were fighting for things, very simple things, and the full suffrage and things like that. But it served as an example of what the authorities will do when working class people rise. So that's the Merthyr Rising. And the next one I'm going to do, and it leads us into the birth of trade unions, is the Tolpuddle Martyrs. Now, the Tolpuddle Martyrs, they were 6 farm labourers. Their names were James Hammett, James Bryan, James Lovelace, George Lovelace, his brother, and then 2 more brothers, John and Thomas Stanfield. They were workers, farm labourers down in Dorset. And they were arrested for swearing an illegal oath of secrecy under a sycamore tree in the village of Tolpuddle in Dorset. The tree's still there, by the way. So what they did, they swore an oath and they formed a friendly society, so a sort of rudimentary trade union. And they were protesting against their employer, who was only paying them 6 shillings a week for their work. The landowner and local magistrate, a chap called James Frampton, found out about these workers' conspiracy and sought to stamp it out. And the 6 of them were arrested and charged under a very obscure and largely unused act called the Unlawful Oaths Act, because the ruling class has got a law for everything when it needs it. and they were found guilty and sentenced to transportation in Australia. When he was sentenced, Lovelace wrote a hymn, because he was a pastor. It was called The Gathering of the Unions, and it includes the line that's often used when people make speeches at Tolpuddle Martyrs Festival now, that we will be free, which is part of the hymn that he wrote. We will be free. We raise the watchword liberty. We will be free. The martyrs became heroes. They became martyrs, in fact, in England. And a petition campaign for their release garnered 800,000 signatures. When you consider we're talking about 1834, and the sheer logistics of getting an 800,000 person signature is very impressive. So the supporters organised a march here in England, one of the most successful in history, and all of the martyrs eventually in 1836 were granted a pardon and returned to England. And from that leads into the Chartism movement. I won't go too much into Chartism, but shortly after the return to England of the Tolpuddle Martyrs, Chartism began to rise across the country, and the Chartists made 6 demands. And again, there's a pattern to what working class people were asking for at the time. It was the vote extended to all men over 21 years of age, that voting take place in secret, the abolition of property qualification for MPs. You couldn't be an MP unless you owned property at this time. MPs to be paid a wage to allow working men to become MPs without rendering themselves destitute. So it gives you the idea that people who were in Parliament were rich landowners, because that was the only people who could afford to be MPs. Equalisation of constituencies, because there was felt, I think at the time, if you've ever seen Blackadder III, you'll know the reference to rotten boroughs, and the little parliamentary constituencies which had 3 people living in it and things like that, and then annual parliamentary elections in order to increase democracy and accountability. Now, Chartism unfortunately failed as a movement. It kind of petered out after about 10 years. But the struggle for franchise reform continued after the Chartist movement had dwindled away. And it's from there that you go on to the establishment of what we would recognise these days as trade unions. So around about this time, craft unions came into existence. So craft unions were specialist workers who organised to maximise their already considerable leverage. So examples of workers who would form craft unions around about that period were things like shoemakers and boat builders and tailors and people like that, tool makers and so on. So these are people effectively who have a very, very specialised skill, and they've got their hands on economic power. So if they don't work, whoever you make your shoes for or your tailors or your suits or boats can't sell them. So you've got a lot of power. Craft unions charged a high membership to people who were members, but gave its members generous benefits, including insurance, sometimes banking facilities, a credit union and things like that. However, they weren't without their weaknesses, craft unions. The advance of technology destroys the profession or the union very, very quickly. A similar example would be the print unions in the 80s, when you had something called hot metal typesetting, which was a skill whereby you created these printing blocks out of hot lead. And for about 30 years, people that did that particular job were extremely well paid, because the skills that were required to do it, bearing in mind you're typing backwards into hot metal to create these blocks, it was a real skill. And then Eddie Shah came along in the mid-80s with his Today newspaper and came up with what was called journalist typesetting. So it was basically that person that had spent all these years learning how to do it didn't need him anymore. It could be done on a computer, and the journalist who wrote the article could actually typeset the whole page. And in one stroke, typesetting was dead, and all the unions and all the power and all the money that they'd earned had gone with it. So an early example of what we would call a trade union in terms that we would recognise today would be a union called the Amalgamated Society of Engineers, which was formed through the amalgamation of a number of craft unions in the late 19th century. And this gave rise to a number of other similarly amalgamated societies. So in simple terms, what are trade unions? So a trade union is an organisation made up of members who by definition must be workers. Their aims are to build working class power in the workplaces that they organise by protecting and advancing the interests of its members at the individual and collective levels. And trade unions maintain their independence but will develop working relationships with employers. Sometimes better working relationships than they should, but perhaps we can talk about that later. So in essence, what do trade unions do? Well, they negotiate agreements with employers. They discuss important changes with employers, such as redundancies. They raise members' concerns with management. They accompany members to grievance and disciplinary meetings. They provide education for reps and members, and they sometimes provide financial and other services too, which I'll come on to later on. So, how do trade unions work? Well, generally, and this is I'm going to talk in general terms because you've got trade unions that are very, very modest in size, 18,000 members, and you've got trade unions that are enormous in size, like Unite, that's got over 1.4 million members. So what I'm saying applies generally to all unions, but some are more intricate than others. But generally, trade unions are organised into branches. One notable example of a union that isn't organised into branches is Nautilus, which is a seafarers union, because there's no real point having branch meetings when half the members are at sea. So they don't have a branch structure as such. But what they do, when they have an annual conference, they invite the entire union. And that anyone who wants to go and isn't at sea and wishes to be able to go can go along. So trade unions will hold an annual or a biannual conference, depending on the size of the union, which sets the union's policy. And in between the branch level and the conference level, it really does depend on the union, but you can have sectors, you can have divisions, you can have regions, you can have all kinds of things. It really does depend on how big the union is. Some unions don't have sectors because they only organise in one specific industry. If you take a union like Unite, the last time I checked, it was 32 sectors, all done by industrial demarcation. So depending on what industry you're in, depending on what sector you were allocated to. And trade unions have an executive committee elected from its membership, which oversees the strategy of the union and sometimes takes decisions in circumstances where there isn't a rule or policy already set for it. And that was where I served for 9 years on my union. Trade unions are governed by a rule book, which covers the organisation of the union, categories of members, how the union uses its funds, including its political fund, the composition and the election of its executive and general secretary, and other matters that might be specific to that particular union and the industry it organises in. So trade unions are almost always governed by trade unions are also governed, by a myriad of anti-trade union laws, which have been pushed into law over the last 35 years, essentially after the miners' strike. After the miners' strike in 1984-85, a raft of legislation was put in and maintained by governments of all colours to suppress trade union activity. These laws govern virtually every aspect of trade unions' work, from how often the GS is elected, the General Secretary, to how often ballots are conducted, how ballots for industrial action are conducted, voting thresholds, and so on. Trade unionism has been in decline. It has to be said, it's been in decline for the last 35 years. It organises 6.5 million people in Britain now. But that has to be taken into account against the workforce. So we've got 6.5 million people in trade unions, 32.5 million people are in our workforce. That means there's 26 million people that don't have a union. So just to give you an idea of where membership of trade unions has gone, a good place to start as a reference point is 1979, because that was when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister for the Tories. Back then, there was roughly 59 million people living in this country. There were 13 million trade union members. Now in 2020, there's 67 million people in this country, and there are only 6.5 million trade union members. So trade union strength is almost entirely concentrated in the public sector, and that brings a problem because in the main, most people who work in the public sector don't have what's called their hands on the levers of economic power. So when they withdraw their labour, they don't threaten capital because they don't make things and create things that can be sold. They provide services. And so when they go on strike, in some cases, you wouldn't even know they'd been on strike because the effect that they had on your day-to-day life was so negligible, it wasn't really worth their while going on strike. And that's been a problem. There's a number of factors for it. Deindustrialisation's a big one, which really accelerated after the miners' strike in 1985. But it also has to be said that the trade unions have played safe and have focused on public sector. for their membership. So the decline of trade unions since 1985 has led to retreat from the private sector and to proliferation of the servicing model. Now, the servicing model for trade unions is simply that you would join as a member, and that's it really. You will get some paperwork in the post, you might get a membership card, you'll get some forms so you can pick up some services, make a few savings when you go shopping online. But apart from that, that's it. You'll never hear from them again unless there's a ballot that they want you to vote in, or you might get some contact from your branch. But essentially, you pay for a service, and that service is that if you get into trouble, you'll get a rep. If you are invited to speak at a branch, or you're invited to speak, you're able to speak. But essentially, if you don't want to become involved in your trade union, the union won't make you. And you are able to be as active or inactive as you choose to be. The other thing that's caused a lot of the problems with the trade union movement in this country, and this goes back way beyond the miners' strike, in fact goes back almost to where we were talking about earlier on with the Chartists. There hasn't been a vanguard political party to represent the interests of the working class. There's been a party that said it represents the interests of the working class, but the Labour Party has frankly never represented really the interests of the working class. So it's always been a problem, and it's come up time and time again, starting with the general strike in 1926, where Labour condemned it within days of the strike beginning, to 1985 with the miners' strike, where Neil Kinnock effectively turned his back on the miners and left them hung out to dry. So that's been the problem, and I hope that the Workers' Party can become that vanguard party, so it can become the voice of working class people in Parliament, for instance.
A Labour Party which is a caricature of its name, which has no connection to the British working class, in fact doesn't even like them very much. And the British working people are repaying the compliment. The British people have fallen out of love with Labour. It's time for change.
So, just continuing the thought about the general decline of trade unionism in this country, the Blair government and the European Union brought about some additional rights for workers, but there was no repeal of anti-trade union laws, and all the rights that were written into law were not given to unions, they were given to individual people. And both Blair and the EU had similar approaches where they believed that the empowerment of the individual was more important than the empowerment of the collective. And that's pervaded everything that Blair did during his tenure and everything that the EU has done since they established themselves. So deindustrialisation and transformation of the economy from industrial to service, as well as the casualisation of the workforce with things like zero-hour contracts, proliferation of self-employment in roles that are traditionally employed jobs, has weakened the trade unions. And the trade unions are viewed by workers as an insurance these days, a way to get a rep if you get into trouble, and someone to negotiate your pay rise on your behalf and so on. One of the other problems that affects the trade union movement is this disconnect between the rank and file membership and the trade union bureaucracy. So there's always been a disconnect between the rank and file and the bureaucracy. However, if you go back to a period in the late 70s and early 80s, although there was a disconnect, there was a tendency for the General Secretary and the Executive Committee of unions to be pulled along by their members. Because what members were doing then, given that the law on ballots, industrial ballots and things like that was essentially you could meet in the car park and put your hand up, and if you all put your hand up, you're on strike. Because of that, the workers were able to say to their General Secretaries and executives, we're going to do this action. If you come with us, that's great. But if you don't, we're going anyway. And this meant that the General Secretaries and Executive Committees of unions were constantly being pulled around by their own members to actually agitate and organise on their behalf. Doesn't happen so much these days, I'm afraid. So trade union membership has gone up slightly since the beginning of the pandemic. But essentially, it's not because of anything that trade unions have done. It's because people were terrified for their jobs at the beginning of the pandemic, and there was talk of economic Armageddon, and people were thinking, well, I better join a union just in case. So let's just sum up where we are before I open it up for discussion. So, and I always find when I do these sort of talks, it's very hard not to be negative, because there is a lot of defeat in the working class at the moment. But I am hopeful of effective change, and I'm going to give you one example of how you can affect change in a trade union. But we've got a membership in the trade union movement that's halved in about 40 years. We've got a servicing model prevalent in most trade unions. We've got a disconnect between members and the bureaucracy of trade unions. Trade unions have been suppressed by legislation. There are 13 unions remaining in the thrall of the Labour Party. And there's an osmotic relationship between affiliated unions and the Labour Party. And by that I mean, there is, when you get to the very high end of trade unions, when you get to that bureaucratic layer at the very top, the odds of you being able to get a councillor position or an MP's position or get a paid staff's position in the Labour Party becomes greater. And conversely, the chance of you working for Labour and then all of a sudden getting a job in the trade union movement becomes greater too. And the people move back and forth between the two entities. So, got a lack of class consciousness. I mean, that effectively is one of the biggest problems that the trade union movement has got, is that for a myriad of reasons, but partly because of where trade unions tend to recruit their staff from, and I mean in terms of organisers and so on, there's been a real decline in class consciousness. We don't run weekend schools anymore. Weekend schools used to be, a trade union would book a hotel for the weekend, members could come, they would be put into a big room and lectured at for 2 days, and then have a few pints afterwards. But they would be taught things about class struggle, they'd be taught things about the Tolpuddle Martyrs, and they'd be told things about the Chartists and the Merthyr Rising and things like that, and how working class people have always struggled against the ruling class. We don't do any of that anymore. And the problem with that is that's created a kind of consciousness vacuum within the trade union movement, and that's been filled with identity politics. So we've got a proliferation of identity politics. We've got trade unions putting people in little boxes depending on their colour, their religion, their sexual orientation, and all kinds of other factors. Another problem that affects trade unions, it's not a new phenomenon, but it's one that causes problems nonetheless and causes a great deal of frustration, is what I call bureaucratic lag. And what that means is, how long does it take one member of a trade union to actually effect a change within that trade union? From the moment the person gets the thought in their head to the moment what they want to do gets done. And you get the thought in your head and you have to take it to your next branch meeting, which could be 4 weeks away, 6 weeks away, maybe 8 weeks away. And you go to your branch and you go, yeah, okay, we'll write to the General Secretary and we'll have it raised at the next Executive Committee meeting. Next Executive Committee's 4 weeks away. So you now could be 10 weeks between your good idea and it actually being talked about. And if it's a good idea that's a piece of idealism, then yeah, that's okay. You could probably wait the 10 weeks. But if it's you in a workplace and the need is here and now, by the time you've talked about it, it's been dealt with. And that's the problem with the bureaucracies in trade unions. They're still very early 20th century. They still work on the premise that you have to write a letter, the letter gets considered, then the branch agrees, then it gets pushed up. And, if you go to a big union like Unite, you could have all kinds of layers you have to go through before you get to the executive that can make any decisions. And then just to close off with one contemporary point, and I'm sure we can talk about it when I've finished. But you only have to look at social media to see how the trade unions have reacted to the situation in Ukraine. There have been statements made by several trade unions and trade unions executives that, in fact, I'll give an example. Sharon Graham tweeted the other day, I think it was yesterday or the day before, a statement from the Executive Committee of Unite. And a rather long meandering statement which criticised the invasion and all kinds of other things, and yet managed to not mention NATO once. Not once was NATO mentioned in a statement about Ukraine, when anyone with a modicum of sense knows that the issues in Ukraine began 8 years ago. They didn't begin 4 weeks ago. But if you listen to trade union general secretaries, that's exactly what they believe. They believe this happened 4 weeks ago, and this is just a piece of aggression on the part of Putin. But obviously we can talk about that in a moment. But all is not lost. there are ways of changing things. There are ways of affecting changing trade unions. And in fact, to sort of give an example of how I've affected changing my trade union, I'm going to give you a personal example. Now, as Peter said, I was on the executive committee of my trade union. I was on there for 9 years, or 9 out of 10 years. It was a broken spell. And by the time I came off the executive committee, I was a national officer of my trade union. So I'll take you back in time. I'll take you back to the 23rd of November 2020. And just by way of context, the Labour Party was in a slightly tumultuous position at the time. There was question marks being raised about Sir Keir Starmer's leadership. He'd just withdrawn the whip from Jeremy Corbyn. Then the NEC gave it back, and then he took it away again. And so we found ourselves in a position where I felt our union, as an affiliated union of the Labour Party, should respond. And so on the 23rd of November, I submitted that letter to my General Secretary in my capacity as the Treasurer, saying I had a number of concerns. I listed my concerns. It's quite a wordy letter because I don't write short letters. But it was a wordy letter, and it basically laid out all the problems that I had with Sir Keir Starmer's leadership at that time. And in the end, I had 3 simple bullet points, which ended with a full and open discussion taking place at the next EC meeting on the performance of Sir Keir Starmer. Now, as any good EC member did, I did a bit of ringing around and seeing I could get people on board. I had a few people, but not that many. And so I pushed the case. I said that we should at least appraise. I wasn't talking about disaffiliation. I said we should at least appraise our relationship with the Labour Party. And essentially what they said was, well, we'll just wait and see. I mean, we'd seen everything from Sir Keir that there was to see. I didn't see what else there was to see. So, not undeterred, I went away and turned that letter into this motion. Now, this was a motion that I got through my branch and submitted to annual conference in Birmingham last September. Now, I couldn't attend because at the time, I couldn't attend as a delegate because I was on the executive committee when they were calling for nominations for delegates. And I also couldn't be there in any capacity because I was at the trade union event that we ran, also in Birmingham. So I was in Birmingham, but I wasn't in Birmingham, if you know what I mean. So anyway, I condensed that letter into this motion, and it's a series of bullet points criticising the leadership of Sir Keir Starmer, and then calling for 2 resolutions. One was to convey the terms of this motion to the Labour Party and to commence a consultation exercise with members on our union's future relationship with the Labour Party. And thanks to the hard work of a delegate from my branch, who was a first-time delegate and absolutely smashed her speech out of the park, this got through by 2 votes. This got through. So when you're near the top, you don't necessarily get what you want. But when you're coming up from the bottom, you sometimes can. Yeah? And that's a first-hand example of how, for people that want to aspire to become executive committee members, you might find yourself have less scope to change things up there than you might think. But when you're at the bottom, if you know what you're doing and you know the ways to do it, you can affect real change in trade unions. I will say that did quite embarrass my union, that getting through, but that's all part of the job, isn't it? So what I'll do now, I'll close on this. I've got some handouts here. If you wouldn't mind just dishing a few of these out, Peter. So the trade union group that I'm the chair of, we're a collection of active and formerly active trade unionists. And what we're trying to do is to try and obviously encourage people who aren't in trade unions to join them, but we're also trying to encourage trade unions to be the best that trade unions can be. And one of the things that we're doing is, and one of the pieces of work that we've completed, and you're one of the first to see this outside the trade union group, is this Charter for Changing Trade Unions. So it's intended to serve as a set of principles for Workers' Party members in the way that they engage with their trade unions. So it's a 10-point plan for all trade unionists, rank and file members, reps, stewards, organisers, activists, anyone else. If you're a trade union member, we'd like you to take this charter with you and sort of use it as your guide for all the work that you do within your trade unions. So we believe that this plan will give trade unionists a manifesto for effecting real and lasting change in 21st century trade unions, to release them from the shackles of the Labour Party, to open and strengthen democracy within trade unions, to increase accountability of trade union officials, and to fight to reclaim the freedoms and rights which have been denied to trade unions by repealed and sustained attacks by governments of all colours since the mid-80s. The trade union group proposal is very simple. It's that for every trade unions to make this 10-point plan part of their everyday work in their trade union, be it at their branches, their combines, their divisions, their conferences and anywhere else in the trade union movement that they're involved. And we wanted to make it a 10-point plan because obviously the party has a 10-point plan. And we also wanted to make these targets achievable because we believe that all of these are achievable targets within trade unions. So it's to end and curtail any and all financial and non-financial contributions to the Labour Party, CLPs and elected members. To introduce elections for all member-facing trade union officials. That includes people like trade union organisers who often negotiate on behalf of their members, but often are not elected by them. They're employed by the union. To introduce the right of members to recall poorly performing elected officials and delegates. To take steps to reopen, reinvigorate and streamline the democratic structures of trade unions to all members. That goes back to what I was saying about the bureaucratic lag. To give members the right and means to hold secure, secret electronic referenda on issues that affect them and for those referenda to be binding. That's so that workers who have an issue in a workplace can actually highlight these issues to their unions without the unions effectively trying to brush it under the carpet because it's too difficult to solve. To give members the right to scrutinise and determine the salary and expenses of their officials. To defend and promote the right of trade union members to freely associate with any political organisation they choose. To introduce an ongoing member-led and accountable campaign to recruit new members on a principle that no worker should be without a trade union, something that trade unions don't do anymore. To found a member-led and ongoing campaign to repeal all anti-trade union laws. And then finally to support an inquiry into blacklisting encompassing victims of blacklisting in the past and to investigate blacklisting now and in the future. And that's the 10-point plan. That's what we want to take out. And if as a trade union member, if you can get one or two of those things, it's going to make your trade union a better place to be. Not only for yourself and your colleagues, but for any future trade unions that come in behind. But that's it. I'm going to stop there and have a sip of water. Thank you for the time. And if you've got any questions or comments, I'm here.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.